So let me just start to open the presentations by introducing our first plenary speaker, Professor Louise Ravelli. Louise is Professor of Communication in the School of the Arts and Media at the University of New South Wales, Australia, and she's Joint Chief Editor of the very prestigious journal Visual Communication. Louise has a long-standing interest in understanding how language, images, and other modalities, including spatial design, work in communication contexts. So she uses multimodal discourse analysis and systemic functional linguistics. What a team. Her books include Multimodality in the Built Environment, Spatial Discourse Analysis, and that's published by Routledge in 2016 with co-author Robert McMurtry. Museum Texts, Communication Frameworks, 2006 by Routledge again. Routledge are so supportive of SFL, aren't they? I just think they're marvelous, but not the only. Other people are too, Equinox and others. Museum Text, Communication Frameworks, doctoral writing in the creative and performing arts, and that's by Libri in UK on 2014, and that's with Brian Poltridge and Sue Starfield, a really practical and informative text. So the title of Louise's talk today is Museum Communication in the 21st Century, a New Research Agenda. So I'd like to welcome Louise and hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Sally. I will just start by sharing my slides. Okay. All right, all good? Sally, you will have to jump in and tell me if anything's wrong at any point, okay?
No, Vin will do that.
Vin will do that. Okay, well, my thanks to Vin and the organisers for their invitation and for this rich and exciting conference. As we come to the end of another exhausting year, let's hope that the energy projected through this conference will help launch us into a far better 2022. I'd like to acknowledge that I speak today from Wangal land and pay my respects to elders past and present, and pay my respects to emerging leaders of this community. And I'd also like to acknowledge important contributions to this paper by my colleague, Jennifer Blunden, creative producer at the State Library of New South Wales. We've had many conversations of late and begun working together on several projects. So her wisdom and ideas infuse a lot of what I will be saying here today. Though I must add, should anything be amiss, she bears none of the responsibility. And I'd also like to thank all of you who are here now and perhaps later on recordings for participating. It is a great convenience that we can do this online, but some of us do it, you know, in the middle of the night or at the crack of dawn, or even in our own time zone. It's in between other work and life commitments that don't stop. So very much appreciate your participation here today. And please forgive me if I'm reading quite a lot today and that my eyes are moving all around the screen and so on. It's a little bit hard to manage this, this mode of communication. Okay. So in 2006, I was fortunate to be able to release a book, Museum Texts, Communication Frameworks. Fortunate because the ideas in the book had arisen from productive collaboration opportunities with the Australian Museum. Fortunate because I had had secure academic employment to enable me to pursue this research. And fortunate because after talking about it one day, Jim Martin said to me, "Why don't you write a book about it?" One of those seemingly incidental comments which gave me the idea to make the work concrete. And thank you, Jim. That book was primarily about the written labels used in text exhibitions, how the gobbledygook of most exhibition labels could be improved by attention to thematic development, how the complexity of text could be improved largely by avoiding the advice of plain English guides, how the nature of the language used can construct different relations with audiences, as well as a different character for the museum itself, and also how choices in language could construct different representations of the world, how it could be used to tell different stories. All of this came from and made good sense to SFL audiences. While exhibits at the first Museum of Natural History were very few, it can also be said that display practices were very simple, and they also used just any old cave. At the time of this book, I also tried to account for broader senses of communication and wrote that communication within a museum, potentially encompasses all of an institution's practices which make meaning, from the pragmatic effect of whether or not there is an admission charge, which makes meanings about what the institution is and who may enter it, to the overall aesthetic impact of the building, to the organisational layout of the galleries, to the written texts pasted on the walls or written in brochures which support exhibitions. Not everyone agreed with this sense of museum as text, as opposed to just texts in museums. But over time, I've come to feel more and more that this is the case. To paraphrase organisational studies scholar Renata Meyer, museums are inherently semiotic organisations. Sorry, just one moment. Museums are inherently semiotic organisations, and of course, being semiotic entities. And of course, being semiotic entities means that they are also social entities. That is, they exist in and through their meaning-making practices, formed through and by particular social conditions. As semiotic entities, museums are inextricably bound with social context. Edamer draws attention to what is at stake here, resemiotization. He describes this as being about how meaning-making shifts from context to context, from practice to practice, or from one stage of a practice to the next. He says that resemiotization is crucially interested in how materiality or expression serves to realize the social, cultural, and historical structures, investments, and circumstances of our time. And Van Loen discusses a similar notion, recontextualization, coming from the work of Bernstein, which also informs Edamer's work, with discourse being the recontextualization of social practice. So museums resemiotize. They've always been resemiotizers of social practice, the social practices of collecting, classifying, curating, and presenting, among others. Understanding how this came to be, however, requires, as Van Loen has argued, attention to history. Now, even if we might feel that many of the museums we know have changed little or are changing little, it's nevertheless the case that over time we can see dramatic shifts in different periods of the birth and evolution of museums. As is well known, cabinets of curiosity of the 16th and 17th centuries were particularly important as a precursor to public museums. These cabinets, meaning rooms rather than actual cupboards, were owned by the elite, royalty, the rich, who could afford to travel and gather these objects or to purchase them from those who had travelled. They were private and viewed by invitation. So the social practices of travelling and collecting are resemiotized, recontextualized in practices of display. Arnold writes about this. Visiting England in 1599, the German traveller Thomas Platter declared that the country's most resplendent objects may be seen in and around London. Platter was also significantly impressed with his visit to the home of a certain Walter Cope, who, he reported, led us into an apartment stuffed with queer foreign objects in every corner. The fashion in which Cope filled his rooms with such curiosities as a unicorn's tail, small raising of eyebrows there, the Queen of England's seal, an Indian canoe, and Chinese boxes was certainly exceptional, possibly even unique. Though unusual in England at the beginning of the 17th century, cabinet and repositories had by its end become quite common, with more than 100 smaller private collections and some half-dozen institutional museums scattered across the country. Initially, the cabinets were noted primarily for their function in creating wonder and awe, and a German name for them is Wunderkammer. Over time, this recontextualization begins to bring its own practices into the mix. Cabinet began to include collections centered on interest, such as scientific or medical collections, rather than oddity and exclusivity, and taxonomizing processes were introduced into the practices of displaying collections. Also, viewing became somewhat more accessible, for example, through being a member of a scientific society. rather than an individual friend of a wealthy owner. Over further time, and skipping over a significant history of world fairs, exhibitions and theme parks running in parallel with the development of museums, we arrive at what we might think of as a typical museum of the late 18th, the 19th and early 20th century, such as the British Museum. These museums showcase the plunder of colonial expansion and the oddities of the exotic New World. The presentation of these acquisitions was guided by emerging scientific and cultural fields, botany, for example, anthropology. The specialist role of curator also began to emerge, as someone was needed who understood or who could make manifest the significance of these objects. Another shift at this time was that museums were open to the general public and were seen to have an important educative role, especially for the masses. Tony Bennett famously refers to this as organized walking. He says the museum bestows a socially coded visibility on the various pasts it organizes. It materially instantiates the retrospective prophecies of the various sciences of history and prehistory, embodying them in linked chains of events, natural and human, which press ever forward to the present point of civilization, which is both their culmination and the point from which these connected sequences are made retrospectively intelligible. For the visitor, reaching the point at which the museum's narrative culminates is a matter of doing as much as of seeing. The narrative machinery of the museum's backtelling took the form of an itinerary whose completion was experienced as a task requiring urgency and expedition. That is, the emerging scientific and anthropological disciplines were used to order and classify. The sequencing of objects within galleries and galleries within the museum created a framework for the education of the visitor. But of course, we know the fusty museum of old has changed a lot. In the late 20th century, we see further change, particularly in relation to the new museum, the post museum, the blockbuster museum, even if it is in the same place, as in this case, the British Museum. This shows a formerly open courtyard at the British Museum, which was closed over to create a new circulation space and to enclose the famous reading room. It's actually a space of 2 acres, which gave the museum 40% extra usable space, although none of this is devoted to exhibitions. As Parry et al. Say in discussing museum thresholds, anyone who's been involved in major planning in museums will know that the foyer is endlessly complex. When we design our museums and we think about museum visitation, we have an opportunity to dissolve the idea of the gallery visit as the primary activity. And of course, we've seen this shift in many places around the world. One example is the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which also blended the new into the old by enclosing a previously open space to allow new entry points and circulation. And these kinds of shifts in architecture and design are clear responses to the pressures of mass tourism and the incredible visitor numbers that occurred in the before times, pre-pandemic. There have, of course, been many entirely new buildings and new institutions, iconic masterpieces of structural design and technology. This is the Chinese Academy of Fine Arts, the Kafa Art Museum in Beijing, with its new building opened in 2008, not somewhere that I have yet had the opportunity to visit. And this is the new Louvre Museum in Abu Dhabi, opened in 2017, also somewhere I haven't had the chance to visit yet. All these, of course, showcase the wealth and capability of the host nations, as the Cabinet of Curiosity once did for their individual hosts. So variations like these very often coexist rather than succeed each other, as Van Leeuwen has pointed out on a number of occasions. An example of this kind of overlap of sort of different time periods and so on can be seen in the Museum of Portuguese Language in Sao Paulo, Brazil, which I wrote about with Viviane Heberle prior to the demise of the museum due to a very unfortunate fire. The museum has since reopened, but neither of us have yet had the chance to visit. The original museum, housed in a former railway terminal, had 3 levels, each of which was quite distinct in style and content from the other levels. So level 1 had a highly interactive exhibition and is a temporary gallery. At the time that we visited, the exhibition was focused on a famous literary work, the Grand Setau Veredas, written by João Guimarães Rosa in 1956, and widely considered to be one of Brazil's greatest works of literature. So on this level, so the whole museum is about language, but on this level, in this exhibition, language is construed as something that only comes alive when it is interacted with, and it construes the visitor as strongly agentive. So the visitor must act in order to get anything out of the displays. So you have to look through things, pull things down, use mirrors to see writing in water and so on. Level 2 is what we might think of as a largely conventional exhibition, reasonably static displays, some dynamism in there, things to read, things to look at. And this level construes language as, among other things, as the sum of where it comes from. It discusses the origins and the history of Brazilian Portuguese. It also presents language as being part of everyday experience. There are examples of it being spoken, sung, and written by everyday people, and as something to be learned about through reading or through games. Level 3 presents a highly immersive exhibition like a planetarium where you go in, you sit down and watch something unfolding on the ceiling overhead. And this level construes language as something immersive and inherently symbolic of cultural values. Visitors here are senses only, watching and hearing, and also circumstances of accompaniment that is not central to the symbolic process of language itself in the way that it's presented here. So these brief summations of highly complex multimodal texts across this museum are arrived at through multimodal analysis of the exhibition design, investigating the spatial, visual, and linguistic resources for their representational, organizational, and interactional meanings, and for how particular patterns of meaning are foregrounded. The point here is to demonstrate that patterns which typify different eras can in fact coexist in the one institution at the one time. So a very loose summary of these archetypal patterns I might describe in this way. The cabinets of curiosity, a form of randomized looking, where the visitors are peers of the owner, and their role is to gaze and wonder what is before them. Sort of classical museum is more about organized walking in Bennett's terms, where visitors are public and their role is to be educated, to receive the messages. And in the post-museum of the late 20th century, we have a more of an engaged, interacting form of connection. Not quite sure how to put that. Visitors are still the public, although more diverse public, and their role here is to be engaged, to be interactive. So let's just look at the shift between sort of what I'm calling the classical museum and the post-museum. So what are some of the key differences here? So we see that exhibitions shift from predominantly taxonomic displays to be observed and absorbed to displays that are more experiential. There are things for the visitor to do other than walking and looking, such as flaps to turn over or buttons to press. Another key shift in emphasis is from the all-important role of the curator to that of the visitor and the visitor's understanding of the exhibition. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was a huge research focus on visitor studies, including a new association and a new journal of that name, Visitor Studies. And in some, the knowledge of the classical museum is fixed and ideally transmitted to the audience. Whereas in the late 20th century, while knowledge is still presented as being relatively fixed, it is somewhat discovered by visitors through their engagement with displays. So that brings us to the question of what is happening now. Other than having the shouty icon, as I've called it, of the incredible awe-inspiring building to house the museum, what else is new? Of course, as we all know, much has changed. The first is rather obviously technology. Digital media, social networks, virtual and augmented reality have all come to have a place in museums. These provide extraordinary sensory opportunities, creating spaces of immersive wonder within exhibitions. Technology enables access to other worlds through virtual reality experiences. It plays a particularly important role in the external face of museums through their visible presence on websites, not only advertising what's on, but in many cases enabling access to archived collections and access to intimate, if digital, views of exhibitions and of objects. As Diamantopoulou et al. Say, the dazzling pace of development of the digital technologies of communication and information holds out the tantalizing possibility of an entire remaking, not just of communication, but of social relations in all domains affected by these technologies. The museum is entirely drawn to this. Dazzle draws attention, inevitably. The negativity implied in this quote is not to say that technology is just razzle-dazzle, but that we need to look past or through the razzle-dazzle for its implications for meaning and meaning-making. And I will come back to this point later. Another key point of change is the nature of the topics addressed by museums. The compelling issues of our time, including climate change and sustainability, are different in kind from the conventional concerns of museums. These topics cannot be addressed by one discipline alone in a taxonomic division of knowledge, but require multidisciplinary approaches in order to understand and intervene in what's at stake. So it requires rethinking at an institutional level in the organisation of departments within a museum, for example, in the status of curators and who owns what kind of knowledge and so on, demonstrating again that museums are themselves, as institutions, inherently semiotic entities. Similarly, museums are engaging with the social issues of today, not least how to address the repatriation of stolen objects, often the foundations upon which major museums have been built. In line with this, museums are fundamentally rethinking their community relations. As Jennifer and I have written elsewhere, a major change has been museums' reshaping of their relationship with audiences in response to changing social expectations. Museums in the 20th century were seen largely as cultural authorities using experts, scientists, curators to choose what information is important and delivering information to audiences who were in turn largely from the socially and culturally elite. Now the role of museums has been reconceived as being in partnership with its informing communities, owners of specific cultural knowledge, artists, and which aims to reach a far more diverse audience, particularly in terms of cultural and social background. There is also another related shift in the understanding of the increasing diversity and agency of visitors in the meaning-making processes of museums. Kress and Selander write in 2012, how can the museum address an audience that brings with it into the museum an unknowable degree of difference? In other words, socially, and at least pre-COVID, increased leisure and travel opportunities for many around the world have brought greater visitor numbers to museums than ever before, posing a range of challenges, from accommodating multilingual audiences to the needs of children and adults, to those with different accessibility needs. Part of this shift is that visitors are now seen less as the audience and more as part of a community. And there are important developments here in understanding the agency that visitors bring to meaning making within the museum, following the work of Kress and colleagues on issues of interest and design. For example, Diamantopoulou et al. Address the question of how meanings are made and remade by visitors in constantly transformative processes. These foreground the agency of all visitors in the processes of meaning making, as well as underpin the interplay between visitors, their interests, their backgrounds, and their resources with aspects of the environment. As noted earlier, these shifts in emphasis and practice do not necessarily replace previously dominant trends, but coexist with them. And such changes arise precisely because of changes at a social level, and importantly, feed back into such changes as well. These changes highlight the major shifts impacting museum communication today in terms of the what, who, and how that underpins the SFL model. What is being communicated? who is communicating and in what ways in relation to each other, and how is this communication taking place. This leaves the question of why. Museums have multi-pronged missions to collect and preserve important collections, to understand them from the point of view of accepted knowledge bases, and to present these to the public, still largely for educational purposes. But increasingly, museum mission statements are also about driving change. The Australian Museum's current mission statement is to ignite wonder, inspire debate, and drive change. It's interesting how prominent the wonder is here. And it seems to me that many museums are still focused on this, the wow factor. Certainly museums use this, the dazzle, to pull audiences in where they can, and why not? We can see that in this mission statement, where parts of their agenda is to ignite wonder. But they are also trying to do something different. They aim to inspire debate and drive change. That's new and not uncommon in the sector. What I'd like to do now is to look at a recent exhibition, which for all intents and purposes appears to be quite conventional, but which on closer consideration is absolutely not. This exhibition is 8 Days in Camay from the State Library of New South Wales. It opened in 2020. It's developed with Damien Webb, Palawa man, who is the head of Indigenous Engagement at the State Library, Jennifer Blunden, creative producer, and Wendy Osman, designer. The exhibition, as I said, opened in 2020 and marked 250 years since Cook's Endeavour voyage and the 8 days he spent in Camay, also known as Botany Bay and home of the Gweagal people. These 8 days mark a highly contested turning point in Australia's history and one which remains painful for many. And the exhibition recognises the social shift in Australian society since the 200th anniversary in 1980, where there were really massive celebrations of this event. And it's worth noting that this exhibition won a national award, the 2020 Museums and Galleries National Awards, and cited for a beautifully conceived reinterpretation and contemporary repositioning of the Cook Landing in Camay and the subsequent impact. So I'll just take you through very briefly the rooms of this exhibition. So the first room, ignoring the text on the left here, which comes from somewhere else, when you step into the first room here, the room is filled with contemporary artworks by Indigenous artists, all of which problematise the received history of Cook's arrival in Australia and discovery of Australia. So this is the very first room, and all the interpretive texts about the artworks here are written by local Wiradjuri artist Carla Dickens. Visitors then move past this introductory panel, and I'll come back to that later, into what we might call the main room, where we can see various kinds of visual displays, written text on the wall. There are audio installations as well, which you can hear at different points in the exhibition. And there are objects in glass boxes, notably four journals from the original expedition and various sketches and so on. And the third room is about the commemoration of Cook's landing in the 200th anniversary. But what is shown here is the protests about that commemoration. And what is foregrounded here are the images of activists, both large scale, but also individual portraits of them, and their voices and their words about the protest of the 200th anniversary. So what's different about this exhibition? Most importantly, the decision-making and curation, the processes of production, as Crescent von Lowen would refer to it, were shared with Indigenous communities. Knowledge is by them, not about them. All the exhibition text is by Indigenous writers, for example, including the art labels in room 1 by Celeste Little, and voices of, the name I referred to earlier was an artist, not the writer of the artwork. So Celeste Little wrote the art labels. And there are voices of individuals on audio throughout, from the families of Sims, Bella, Timbri, and Moffat. And in room 3, the voices of activists Udguru Nunakal, Faith Bandler and Linda Trudy Longbottom. The exhibition begins with the artworks that contest dominant narratives, so it thematizes contestation. And the layout of the rooms is very much guided by Indigenous sense of place, particularly land and water. The visuals are contemporary and local, so Indigenous culture is not being represented as being before or as being in the desert. And Indigenous voices and ways of knowing are prioritised throughout. So this prioritisation is achieved through a number of strategies. Indigenous voices are foregrounded across all modes: visual, audio, written and spatial. Spoken testimony personalises this history and connects past with present. European voices appear only in written form. The journals from the original voyage are presented conventionally in glass cases, which helps preserve them and also indicates their historicity, their kind of separateness from current knowledge. Key segments of journal text are woven into the wall labels and the graphics to enable them to be easily read, but always with less prominence than the Indigenous voices. Quotes from Guigal descendants appear in a stronger sans serif font, so they have greater visual presence than the serif fonts used for quotes from the journals. No European-made images of Cook and his party are there, so there's no great portraits of Cook. And place-based photography is used as a critical tool in creating context and in connecting past and present. So there's no stock images, but actual local images are used, which were selected under the guidance of Indigenous knowledge holders. So the museum has heard the shift in the social conscience and instantiated that in their engagement and design practices. In turn, this new design feeds back into the broader social context, strengthening otherwise still marginalised views. Visitors who come to this exhibition, if Indigenous, have their knowledge and experience validated. And if non-Indigenous, very likely have their received knowledge about this event garnered through prior school education and previous social history somewhat upended. So representationally, just one moment. Yes, so representationally, the exhibition shows a representation that inverts the received narrative in terms of agency. It's about we, the Guigal people, discovered them, the strangers. It provides a different representation of knowledge, not taxonomic and not focused on precious objects, but on Indigenous sense of place and the continuity of history. Interactionally, Indigenous people speak for themselves. They are not spoken of. High validity is ascribed to Indigenous words, both written and spoken, and to an Indigenous sense of place. As I said before, it's not othered and not exoticized. Organisationally, Indigenous knowledge is foregrounded throughout at the level of the institution, the level of the exhibition, and the level of the exhibit. So they're resemitizing social practice multimodally. Sorry, I have lost a page there. I wanted to include, just one moment, please. Okay, so let me turn now to what happens when this exhibition moves online. So the exhibition was always intended to be a temporary exhibition in place for a certain amount of time, but it does have a second life online through the wonders of new technology. So online, the majority of the content is retained, but it is necessarily presented differently because of the differences in mode. After a warning regarding cultural sensitivity of the material, the opening slide includes this text about 8 days in Kamay. So the first line says, on the 29th of April, 1770, the Guigal people of Kamay, Botany Bay, discovered James Cook and his crew as they sailed into the bay and came ashore. So linguistically, this immediately inverts the received narrative of this contact, i.e. that the Guigal people discovered James Cook and not vice versa. And throughout the online representation of the exhibition content, the motif of contestation continues to appear. Also in the online setting, Indigenous voices are still prioritised in that they appear first in the unfolding scroll of web pages, and in that it is only Indigenous voices which are heard, rather than, for example, Western experts as commentators. But some things from the original exhibition have been lost. The presence of the contemporary artworks, for example, are no longer an introduction to the exhibition. These are found much further down in the long tail of this website. And soon the priority of the website gives way from Indigenous voices to the journals as objects and to the interpretation of these. So we see the interpretation of the original journals foregrounded here. In other words, moving things online is literally moving things. And in organisational terms, this changes what is salient. Representationally, it changes what the exhibition is about. And interactionally, it brings us closer to the journals, reinstating their high cultural validity from a Western point of view and taking us somewhat further away from contemporary Indigenous knowledge. In SFL and multimodal studies more broadly, we know that putting things in different ways has consequences for meaning, and that every mode has its own gains and losses, to use Kress's terms. So if nothing else, the transformation of museum exhibitions to online modes is a source of fertile examples for critical analysis. But equally importantly, we can also use our analytical skills as a resource for thinking about how to do things differently. I think it is not incidental that this exhibition had a creative producer, Jennifer Blunden, and a designer, Wendy Osmond, who is skilled in SFL and social semiotics. Background knowledge about the importance of placement of objects and texts, or the significance of otherwise trivial features such as font choice, have infused this exhibition, the original in situ one in particular, with an entirely original approach to the issue. It is also not incidental that development of the exhibition was underpinned with Indigenous leadership through the head of Indigenous engagement, Damien Webb, and genuine engagement with the relevant knowledge holders. And thus the exhibition manifests a deep respect for the peoples and culture impacted by Cook's 8 days in Kamei. But this is one exhibition. How can this kind of background knowledge underpinning this exhibition be expanded to infuse other exhibitions and other museums? So this takes me to new questions. Although looking at this, I'll probably never use the title new in a presentation again, because most of these are questions we do, in fact, already ask. So in addition to the ongoing questions about the critical role of language, how to write clearly, what view of the world is represented, what relations are constructed, we need to add, how do museums communicate multimodally? How does the design of an exhibition construe meanings? As you would know, many people from many different theoretical positions, including but not limited to SFL, already ask these questions and provide some very interesting answers. But this knowledge needs to be explicit within the sector itself. In particular, a multimodal metafunctional analysis can be used to evaluate if and how these meanings are aligned with institutionally stated objectives, with social agendas. And if they are not so aligned, we can ask how multimodal resources can be used to recalibrate, to reset, and to represent more appropriately. Similarly, we can ask, when the same exhibition is experienced in or via different modes, what meanings remain constant, what meanings change? And if an exhibition appears in one mode only, what are the gains and losses associated with that? Again, there needs to be institutional and sector-wide awareness of these factors, not just enthusiastic uptake of new and exciting communication potentials. How then do we approach this agenda? Other than analysing an exhibition or two and showing what works and what doesn't. We need to, first of all, identify what's out there, who is doing what and where. We need to understand the variation in the sector, its points of change, as well as its points of stasis. We need to look closely at specific examples. Detailed, qualitative, critical analysis reveals how these processes work in place. Preferably, we want to be selecting examples of best practice, such as 8 days in Kamei. And really importantly, we need to work with institutions, not as the object of our academic study, but as research partners. It's relevant to note here that organizational studies scholars emphasize the importance of this shift in thinking and of how essential it is to understand organizations from the inside as well as from the outside. Museums are, after all, first and foremost semiotic entities, and we need to understand them in all their complexity, not just in terms of the final text that they produced. And most importantly, we need to use the rich range of tools we have now for multimodal analysis of language, of images, of the built environment, and for articulating a complex notion of meaning, as we have in SFL, to reveal the potential of these tools to inform design thinking and reflection in the museum sector. So we need to account for the factors that have impacted museums already in the 21st century. Technology, of course, as well as new priorities in terms of issues, multidisciplinary approaches to knowledge, and changed community relations. We need to provide clear accounts of the diverse communication resources available to museums, more insight into the nature of language, of images, of spatial design. We have these tools at our disposal, but they are not easily translated for new audiences. The metafunctional approach, so familiar to us, is not widely understood, but enhancing understanding of this and demonstrating how it works in specific texts is crucial. Part of this, and equally crucial, is a social semiotic framework. That is a framework which relates the specifics of communication to its social context. And we need to do this without seeing museums just as an object of our own study, a site for interesting analysis. Rather, we need to appreciate them as complex organizations, as semiotic entities. And these semiotic entities are socially engaged and socially transformative, and our tools have the capacity to support this agenda. So what we want to have now is to support museums working towards an institution that includes, but also goes beyond wonder. Museums are without doubt socially engaged institutions with the potential to both reflect and instantiate social transformation. And the tools of a social semiotic metafunctional framework can support an active and proactive communication strategy which effectively meets these needs. That is my research agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Louise Ravelli. That's so inspiring and informative. And hello, Celia, are you still there?
Oh, yes, of course I'm here. Yes, I know that you took responsibility for the recording, so I just give up responsibility. It's like when the party starts, I become a guest. So, Louise, thank you so much for that. That was truly amazing in your talk, and I'd like to open up the discussion for any questions. I can see lots of questions in the chat, and I'd like to ask people who did put questions in the chat or comments, like Didam's, kind of a really thing to add, to join the discussion and voice those questions and comments to keep the conversation that Louise has begun going. So Margot, would you like, Margot? I'll ask your questions to get started with. I know it's not in order, but you've been wonderful in stepping these out. Would you like me to read them out, or no, Margot? You address your questions. You talk directly.
Okay, thank you. Just a few questions. I'll start with a funny one. Was that unicorn tail real, and is it currently for sale somewhere?
Of course it is real.
Very real. Okay.
But it was the only one.
Oh, yeah, very precious and unique. And secondly, you were talking about labeling and categorizing items at the start of your talk. And when these are carried out by a Western institution, of course, they are acts expressing power. So do you think that meanwhile, a real power shift has occurred in terms of what is being collected, preserved, or presented to the public, and how. And you did explain that, you did get to that after I came up with my question at the end of your talk, when I was still thinking about all of the power structures. So do you think that the power shift has occurred, and do institutions really seek input from Indigenous people in how exhibitions are organized? But most importantly, are Indigenous people actively involved in the decision-making process and asked for their expertise, not just for their opinion? So do you think this type of meaning making is indeed a shared activity? That's my question.
Yeah, thank you. So the shift hasn't occurred everywhere, of course, but I think it is, the ground is really moving, particularly in Australia. Although it's notable that the 8 days in Kamei exhibition is different from other exhibitions, certainly from the past. So my understanding, I think Jennifer Blunden might be there, she might want to jump in at some point. My understanding is that they really, the museum went to the Indigenous owners here. Damien Webb is not from this particular community. He's not from Sydney originally, or certainly not from Botany Bay. So even he doesn't have the cultural knowledge about this event. And my understanding is that they started by going to the Indigenous knowledge holders and asking them about it. And the Indigenous perspective on this event has been handed down through oral history, through generations. So it's quite current it's quite current knowledge in current communities. And that was the starting point for developing this exhibition. Of course, every step, like deciding to have an exhibition in the first place, okay, at this very sensitive time of commemorating, celebrating, or protesting this you know, pivotal moment in Australia's history, every decision, including a design decision, will start with the artworks. You know, yes, these not all of these decisions are made with the communities, but there has been a real shift in trying to include them as much as possible. And yes, and I think it is really important to bring out how important that kind of engagement is, and how important it is to do it substantially and not superficially and not trivially. So I don't know if that fully answered your question, but I think the ideal is that they are fully involved.
Yeah, thank you very much, Louise.
Jennifer would like to jump in there. Jennifer.
Hi. Okay. Yeah, look, thanks. And I just said, thanks, Louise. That was a fantastic talk. Thanks so much. But just, it is a really uneven landscape. I think some museums are doing amazing things. Some are, and in fact, within the one institution as well, there are different, you know, there are different trends and different influences. So it's a really uneven field, but it is changing. I think if you're interested, there's a the Australian Museums Association has a policy statement, a roadmap that's really useful document that's really trying to shape and lead quite a significant change. I think quite a lot of museums would have on staff Indigenous engagement teams now, and that's
Jennifer, sorry, your volume has just dropped out. Can you just say about our museums having staff?
Oh, okay. So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of museums would have Indigenous engagement teams on staff, Indigenous curators on staff, and that's a change that I think has happened a lot in the last decade. So yeah, it's a very shifting field, but a very uneven field, and it's an exciting time actually for museums in that regard. Thanks.
I can see a question there for, is that Carmen? Carmen? Can't hear you, Carmen. Can't hear you, Carmen. Carmen, I think you're on mute.
Yes. Hello, Louise. Lovely to see you.
Likewise.
Hello.
Hello, Malcolm.
Lovely to hear you from Brazil, and it's 7 o'clock in the evening for us. So a day before. a day before. So great talk, Louise. Lovely, lovely to hear you. Just a very small question. Which language do the indigenous people use in the exhibition? Is it English?
Yes, I think, isn't it, Jennifer? Yes, yes, it is English.
It is English, and no native languages. Any
I think
reason?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that the Sydney languages are very contested. I think they really, I suppose, were affected by that first and most intense wave of colonisation. So there's a lot of, within the communities around Sydney, there's very different approaches to language. So in this exhibition we have, I think that there are probably a few Indigenous words, but the narrative, and again, you know, it is very much in English. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, who takes the decision?
It was the curatorial team and I suppose the project team for that exhibition. Yeah. And the curatorial
team. I was
team.
just interested because when I did linguistics with Michael and Bob Dixon in London, we learned a little bit of a language called Jirbal.
Right.
And so I had a little bit, but I've forgotten it all. But I just wondered whether, you know, the exhibition would be showing the language, you know, to make it clear that they're not talking in English, and this is a way that we've got of getting into the language, but it's not perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, for this, sorry, Louise, I'm jumping in. I mean, for this exhibition, I suppose that wasn't the main priority, the main issue in this regard. And the library did in fact have a very large exhibition on Indigenous languages the previous year, and stepped very actively into that space. There's always in exhibitions, there's always so little space, and there's a lot of priorities, and so it was just what it unfolds as being I guess the key ideas and the key purpose of the particular project involved.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. One additional comment about language is that it's only really very recently that it's become common knowledge outside of Indigenous communities that there are many, many languages, Indigenous language, like hundreds in Australia, and many different Indigenous lands. So I'm on Wangal land. My university is on Gadigal land. The exhibition is about Kamay land of the Guigal people, you know, and so just having that diversity is already quite a shift. And also because of the number of languages, yes, it does make it quite challenging to present, but that's addressed perhaps in other areas, but yeah, it's definitely a relevant factor to consider.
Yeah. Okay, lots and lots of love to you all. See you.
Amelia?
Amelia, yeah.
Hi, Louise, and everyone. Thank you so much for such an exciting start to the conference. It was a really engaging presentation. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to be quick. Now, the first one is just a comment. You know, when you commented that the Guigal perspectives were represented with a sans serif and very bold font, I kind of thought about, yes, in some ways, the sans serif appears bolder anyway because there are not the little squiggles on the sides, but also there are you know, in terms of provenance, there are different associations with these fonts, and I would argue that the sans serif fonts, which I personally find quite alienating because I guess how old I am, I don't know, you know, they are more associated with a more sort of contemporary print culture, a more contemporary, you know, sort of writing. And, you know, I know to say, for example, reading images and other books here that I've got lately, a lot of them are in sans serif fonts. So just thought I'd add that to the interpretation, I suppose. But I had a question.
Sorry, Amelia, can I interrupt you before you go on? Yeah, so that in part, I think Jennifer might want to comment as well, is almost intentional. So the sans serif font is used for Indigenous writing and the transcription of speech to indicate its contemporary nature. Yeah. And the serif font is used for extracts from the journals to help indicate its historical nature.
Yeah, great. Okay. Well, that's really good to know as well. I wanted to, with reference to some of your sort of statements or, you know, future directions at the end, you know, where you said, you know, we need to work in partnership with these organizations and try and understand them from inside. I wondered about what kind of methodologies do you envisage might work, and also whether within SFL we are prepared and well equipped to engage with these methodologies. Partly because I was thinking about the long-standing, I don't want to use the term animosity, but not easy acceptance, I suppose, of ethnographic methodologies and similar. So I was kind of wondering whether you have ideas that perhaps, you know, might be a bit more in line with the SFL focus on.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Amelia. Yeah, I'm not sure about a specific methodology that will work better than another. I think the fundamental thing is the nature of the partnership with the institution. So my original work around language was because of, as I said, a fortuitous partnership with the Australian Museum, and a willingness on their part at that time to engage and to change and to work with the ideas. But also I had to understand them from the inside as well, to understand that, well, there's lots of things. So I think it's more about the approach, you know, of the academic or the research team in relation to the institution, to see them not as subjects, not people that need to be improved or changed, but to understand what they're doing from their point of view and how our tools can help them. And I do think the complexity and sophistication of the SFL understanding of you know, communication resources, not just language, but many others as well, and in particular the metafunctional understanding of meaning, is absolutely key to all of this, because that is really not widely understood elsewhere, and that really brings insights into how things work together to create overall meanings around a particular text or an exhibition and so on. So I think that's critical, is just bringing those metafunctional tools into play and with respect with the institution that you're engaging with.
Thank you.
Didim's just suggested a focused ethnography. Didim, would you like to speak to that in response to Amelia's question? Maybe not. But anyhow, that's there in the chat.
If I could just add something, I was thinking also of how within, say, the way that Van Leeuwen defines social semiotics, as well as the way that Kress talks about social semiotics, and possibly if we go back earlier to Halliday's writing on, you know, the language, the theory of language that we have and how it relates to other disciplines and so on. I think we have a very generally quite an open approach to seeing all sorts of different people, whether they openly call themselves as social semioticians or not, as contributing to social semiotics. So anyone who is engaged in developing new semiotic resources or thinking about new semiotic resources can be considered to contribute to social semiotic research. And that sort of allows us to, for example, also consider the work that artists might be doing as researchers from a social semiotic perspective. So yeah, just that point that I was thinking.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I just saw in the chat one question. Some of them I can't really follow them all, but Meg has a question: how exhibits like this are funded and support for counter narratives? Is funding part of the analysis of the discourses that shape the text presented and how presented? Yes, funding is absolutely part of the nature of a museum as a semiotic entity. that's very much part of it. This particular one, the State Library, is a public institution, so it has government funding and some philanthropic funding as well. And the support for the counter narrative here comes from within the institution, really, because it's part of their agenda, their engagement with current Australian society. So they're not told to do this by anyone else, but it's part of what's happening. As Jennifer said, there's a policy for Museums Australia about how to approach these things and so on. It's very much part of the discourse in contemporary Australian society at the moment, and so on. So this is that really broader sense of understanding museums as texts that I referred to in the beginning. But
yeah, it does. It's great. Such a fabulous presentation, and done, to do all of that so well and multimodally, and just really great work. But it strikes me in some contexts, such as a US context, where fees to get into museums are higher and higher. They're not really public institutions anymore. And it would just be interesting to think about how the proposal for such an exhibit takes shape and travels through the institution and gets tweaked along the way from an ethnographic perspective, and how the counter narrative either is supported or squashed in some respects, or how it all turns into a tea towel at the store as you walk out, which always strikes me in the US. It's the commercialization, privatization of it all. But such great work, really wonderful. I'd love to be able to do something similar, but I'll just have to watch it.
Just on that, I know that Theo Van Even and a colleague have a paper in press at the moment that he's allowed me to look at, and it is actually looking at his work in the health with a health organisation, and it's actually got a whole section of it as process oriented, and really travelling through that negotiation and consultation process that I found really fascinating. So that's something to keep a watch for. Louise might know more about that than I do.
Yeah, well, that goes back to Theo's work on recontextualization and Rick Edamer's work on resemitization. So Edamer was following through what was it? From the process of building something, from the initial meetings to the plans to, its implementation, and all the things that change and sort of get fossilized or slightly reconstrued on the way. And as you say, what you end up with is a tea towel. So that is an extremely interesting perspective and can really reveal a lot of important factors along the way. I guess my approach, I tend to come in at the end and see what's there, but that process of the unfolding development is a really important aspect. Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just make a quick comment there? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry. Look, the process for this exhibition, honestly, that would be another 2-hour talk to talk through. It had a really long tail. It was such a significant event, I suppose, in Australia's history, and there were many different proposals that were put up over probably a decade. I mean, the library knew this event, this anniversary was coming. Our exhibition program is actually quite heavily motivated by anniversaries of different social events that the library has records that relate to. So yeah, it was a very contested project, and it sort of gelled into this shape quite late in the process after wildly different projects were put up.
Yeah, and in the context of Australia's life, it was probably a very good thing that we had COVID in 2020, not for this exhibition per se, but because it totally took the focus away from the commemoration of this event, because there was a lot of public debate. Why commemorate this? Why spend money on other public commemorations like more statues and things like that? So in that respect, COVID was fortunate in terms of avoiding quite a lot of public contestation. Yeah.
Well, look, it's just after 10, but I could just go on forever. I've got so many ideas buzzing in my head about transdisciplinarity and bridging meta languages and all the type of things that I think are really relevant in interactions with organizations and other experts in that kind of field. But thank you so much for starting off this conference in such a fantastic way, Louise. That's absolutely wonderful. And I'm just aware that Muz needs to go and pretty himself up to be chair of a thing because he's 3 hours ahead of us in China. So I'm, just for him, I'm going to say, okay, let's go to morning tea. And I'll just, just in case anybody doesn't know how to get into the breakout rooms, Vin's going to organize that. Don't worry. I'm going to have something to press. So please join us in the breakout rooms at 10:30.
Right. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Vin. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sally, and Professor Louise, Ravelli, and everyone. Now I'm going to do the breakout rooms, and if you like, you can join now or you can have break and you can join at 10:30.